In this video, we are talking about 10 players that you must start in week 12 of fantasy football. But before we get into it, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you do end up enjoying. Starting at number 10 with Rico Dowdle. He's a much better running back than he gets credit for, and you could do a lot worse with 6 teams on bye this week. And Rico could lead you to a fantasy victory this week, and here is why. As he's been utilized a lot more as of late, the Cowboys have finally said, "We're done with you, Zeke. Stay on the bench. You're washed at this point anyway," as Rico has seen 15 plus opportunities in 3 straight games, along with 5 or more targets in 3 out of his last 4 games. And since week 9, Dowdle ranks 7th in yards after contact per attempt, 9th in explosive run rate. And this is more about the matchup than anything, as Washington has allowed the most rushing yards this season, along with the 3rd most rushing touchdowns. And I would be starting Rico with confidence this week. Moving on to number 9, Terry McLaurin, who's coming off a dud performance against a really stingy Eagles secondary, as he finished with just 1 reception for 10 yards. But don't let that stop you from starting him this week. Scary Terry is on his way to a career year, and he's the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game right now, and has scored double-digit fantasy points in 8 out of 11 games this season, while ranking 6th in deep targets, 13th in separation, and 14th in route win rate. Terry should have a monster bounce-back performance against the Cowboys, who have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers since week 6. So Washington probably is going to have command of this game. Jaden Daniels has been a little bit hesitant as of late as he deals with that rib injury, but I think this is the week that they all get back on track, and McLaurin has a really strong fantasy day. At number 8, Bucky Irving racked up 17.7 fantasy points in week 10 before Tampa Bay had their bye, and has scored 15 plus fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. And I've been saying it for a while now, I think Irving is shaping up to be a league winner down the stretch. I hope you bought him for relatively cheap a couple weeks ago, because since week 7, Irving is the RB24, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game, and he's just been sensational with the football in his hands, ranking 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt, 7th in explosive run rate, 13th in yards after contact per attempt, along with 5.6 yards per carry. And the matchup is very juicy against the Giants, who have allowed the most rushing yards and 5.4 yards per carry since week 6. So you could throw Rachaad White in here as well. I think both Tampa Bay running backs have strong performances in week 12. At number 7, Ladd McConkey is coming off his best game of his young career. 6 receptions, 123 yards on 9 targets, 18.3 fantasy points. And since week 8, Ladd is the wide receiver 10 in fantasy, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game, while ranking 3rd in separation over the last month. McConkey has been really impressive. He's a savvy route runner, very strong separator. He can beat you all over the football field, and has been Justin Herbert's top target as of late. And we know Herbert is playing really good football right now. He is scorching hot, and the matchup and the potential game script is as good as it gets for Ladd on Monday Night Football against Baltimore. We know this by now, right? The Ravens are a pass funnel defense and have allowed the most yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game to receivers this season. So I know Ladd's dealing with that shoulder injury. It looks like he is going to be fine. I'm starting Ladd and Quentin Johnston if he is on your roster. At number 6, Brian Robinson Jr. put together a really strong performance last week against the stingy Eagles run defense, finishing with 16 carries, 63 yards, got into the end zone, 14.2 fantasy points. And it appears that Robinson is finally moving past that hamstring injury that has hampered him over the last couple of weeks. Now he gets 10 days rest. Should be very close to 100%, hopefully. Brian has also scored a touchdown in every game but 2 this season. I would expect him to find the end zone with ease in week 12, as the Cowboys have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs. We saw what Joe Mixon did last week. He ran all over the Cowboys. Robinson, not the same type of running back as Mixon, but I'd expect much of the same. I think Brian could have his best game of the season. Austin Eckler is also a nice flex option this week as well. At number 5, Josh Downs. There's no one stopping Downs' breakout season, not even Anthony Richardson, as Downs has thrived with AR back under center. Last week, 5 catches, 84 yards, touchdown, 19.4 fantasy points. And believe it or not, Downs has finished as the wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 11 in his last 2 games with Richardson. So that's really good news because we were hoping for Flacco. Joe has looked pretty poor. So this is what's supposed to happen. Richardson is the franchise quarterback, and I'm glad to see that he's peppering Downs with targets, as Josh is the wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game, 25% target share, 31% first read share, 2.58 yards per route run, while ranking 11th in red zone targets among receivers. Those are all really good things to see. The Colts will probably be trailing by, 40 points at halftime because Detroit is just cooking on all cylinders right now. So we know they're going to be throwing the ball early and often, and that's a good thing. It's a favorable matchup against Detroit, as they've allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game and most receiving yards per game to slot receivers since week 6. So continue to fire up Downs. I think he's going to finish out the year on a really high note and is looking like he could also be a league winner. At number 4, Tyrone Tracy Jr. has been a revelation this year, as he's looking like one of the young stars at the running back position. Kind of crazy to say, but he is playing exceptionally well right now. 15.4 fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks, 21 plus carries in 4 out of his last 5 games. And since week 5, Tracy has been the RB22 in fantasy points per game, averaging 18 touches and 99 total yards, while ranking 9th in explosive run rate, 9th in yards after contact per attempt, 13th in missed tackles forced per attempt. Those are just very impressive numbers. Tracy offers a very safe floor and high ceiling at this point. And even with Tommy DeVito at quarterback, Tracy, who knows, could see more checkdowns in the passing game, because we know Tommy is not going to run as much as Daniel Jones did. And the Tampa Bay Bucks have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. So continue chugging Tracy out there in your running back spot. You got to feel really good if you picked him up or drafted him. He has been incredible. At number 3, Marvin Harrison Jr. has been very inconsistent all year long, but has shown us that he is capable of those big blow-up performances. And I always like to bet on rookies, especially when they are coming out of a bye week. Marvin is the wide receiver 37 in fantasy points per game. Don't love to see that. While ranking 10th in deep targets and has only seen 1 red zone target over his last 6 games. I'd expect things to change though. Kyler Murray playing really good football. This offense as a whole gets a bump because of that. I think Marvin is going to be fine overall. Seattle uses press coverage at the 5th highest rate this season. Only Nico Collins has a higher fantasy point per route run rate versus press than Harrison. So I'm expecting a big game from the rookie in a potential shootout against Seattle, who have allowed the 14th most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. You got to start him at this point because of the talent, because of the situation. And even if 6 teams were not on bye, Marvin should still be locked into one of your wide receiver spots. At number 2, Javonte Williams was extremely efficient with his touches in week 11. 9 carries, 59 yards, 6.6 yards per carry. Got into the end zone, along with 4 receptions, 28 yards, and 18.7 fantasy points. And with Sean Payton deciding that, Williams was going to be the guy last week, it wasn't Audric Estime, to many people's surprise. I think they're going to continue with Javonte at this point, as Williams is the best back that they have in pass protection. They want to protect their franchise quarterback in Bo Nix, which is good for Javonte owners because when he's on the field in 3rd down situations, he has a chance to gobble up receptions out of the backfield. He can not only get it done on the ground, but through the air. I think the Broncos are going to have control of this game early, resulting in a lot of running from Javonte. And that's something that you can do against the Raiders, as they've allowed the 7th most missed tackle rate and 10th most rushing scores this season. Like we talked about, with 6 teams on bye, I think Javonte needs to be in starting lineups and is set up for another nice day. And some may say this is a bold prediction because Javonte, let's be honest, hasn't been great for most of the year, but he's running hot right now. It's a really good matchup, and I just think that the Broncos continue to feature him in this offense. I'm not really worried about Estime stealing that much work. So if you have Javonte on your team, or if you're in a pinch, you need a running back, he is your guy. At number 1, DJ Moore finally snapped his horrid cold streak in week 11. And while he didn't have a huge day, we will take 7 receptions, 62 yards, resulting in 13.7 fantasy points, scoring double-digit fantasy points for the first time since week 5. And with new offensive coordinator Thomas Brown at the helm, it was evident he wanted to feature DJ Moore early and often last week. And this entire Chicago offense, this passing attack, Caleb Williams, they all looked much better with Shane Waldron finally gone. Kind of funny how that works. Waldron, just not a good offensive coordinator at this point. And Moore was peppered with targets underneath last week, which we like to see in PPR leagues. Some people might not like it, but I think Moore is still very dangerous with the ball in his hands. So even if it is a short pass, he is known to make something out of nothing. And Keenan Allen popped up on the injury report on Friday with an ankle issue. So if he's limited, it could be even more work for DJ. And the matchup is one of the best of the week against the Vikings, who have allowed the third most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. I'd expect the Bears to be trailing in this one against the Vikings. So I'm starting DJ Moore with all the buys, with all the injuries. He needs to be in your lineup, and I really trust this offense under Thomas Brown. I think Caleb Williams is a good quarterback, and I think Moore really gets it going in this new system. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you took away anything from the video, if you can please like the video, subscribe to the channel, I would really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.